Hi, and welcome to another video in the Glass Balls series. My name is Pearl Tlabangana, and together with my colleague Denise Snell, we'll be looking at business continuity as another one of those delicate glass balls that management just cannot afford to drop. We'll kick off with looking at the different types of disruptions that can occur, particularly in light of the pandemic at hand. And then we will look at two implementation approaches for your business continuity management program. The first being a comprehensive business continuity plan, and the second tackling a pandemic specific business continuity plan. Over to you, Denise.
Business continuity is about making sure your business operations can continue in the event of a disruption. Let's look at some possible disruptions and different approaches that management can take in implementing a business continuity program for your organization. Historically, when looking at business continuity, one would look at technology, man-made or natural types of disasters or disruptions to business. And the focus on planning for the disruption was around those. Then came 2020, and the pandemic became the biggest disruption of all, literally disrupting the entire world. And in many cases, the business continuity program didn't handle this type of disruption. The type of disruption where there was no damage to buildings or systems that were brought down, but it was really about staff being unable to return to work. So, as management, I think there are two implementation approaches that you can take. The one is to focus on making sure you have a comprehensive business continuity program that looks at all the different types of disruptions. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The other one, if you have other priorities and don't want to spend all the time and effort on a comprehensive business continuity program, is that you could start with a pandemic specific continuity program. I'll go through the elements of a comprehensive business continuity program, after which Pearl will discuss the pandemic specific continuity program and share some insights as to why it's still very relevant to think about this, even though we are at this stage in the pandemic. We've divided a business continuity program into 6 elements or steps shown in the slide. First step would be to define the program. It's important to understand the business, to understand where the organization is in business continuity and what they may have or have not yet looked at. You need to understand the locations, you need to understand where the biggest risk areas are in terms of disruption. And this will inform the scope of the program and help you define the ultimate objectives. The one important thing is to note that business continuity is a process, it's a journey, and it's not something that you are going to implement fully in a couple of months. So it's important to understand the scope of what it is that you want to achieve and then agree on the journey and start with it. The second step is about understanding the disruption threats that the organization faces. So, looking at how possible disruptions could occur. And then, secondly, how vulnerable the organization is to these potential threats. Once you understand and have unpacked how disruptions could occur, you also need to understand what is required for recovery. So, how quickly does a specific process or function need to be operational after a disaster has actually hit? So, for example, think about a fire. Fire is definitely a type of disruption or a threat that an organization is exposed to. But the requirement for recovery will be different, whether it's a manufacturing plant, for example, or whether it's the finance office burning down. So it's important to understand for each type of threat what is required for recovery, which ones are the critical functions, processes, and what are the dependencies that they have to enable them to recover operationally. So once you understand the requirements for recovery, this will inform the next phase where you need to decide on the strategies that you are going to have to implement to meet the requirements to recover. Defining the strategies is one thing, but the strategies have to be relevant and cost effective for the organization. So, for example, if you have call centers and you have decided that the call centers need to be up and running within 2 hours after a disruption, your potential strategies could be rerouting the calls to a different call center. It could be a backup location, or it could be a different type of strategy and moving to cloud technology. Once these strategies have been agreed on by management or the relevant committee, this is when you then start with your continuity plans, where you start developing plans to execute the agreed strategies and solutions. The plans also, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but this is where the business continuity plan will look at things like incident response. It will look at emergency response, crisis communication, and then the actual business and IT recovery and restoration. The next steps to train and test. There's one thing having all these plans on paper or on some sort of a portal, but if the relevant role players are not aware of what their responsibilities are in these events, then really it's not going to benefit. It's not really going to improve your resilience. So training the relevant role players and then also testing, whether tabletop tests or simulation tests, test the plans that have been defined to actually make sure that they work and then update it. So the last step, this is a continuous cycle of reviewing and maintaining the business continuity program. You As new information comes to light, as new threats, for example, in this case, the pandemic comes to light, you should actually review and update your business continuity program and the documentation to make sure that it's still relevant. I think one of the key differences between a successful and an unsuccessful business continuity program is whether the role players really know what they need to do and why. If it's really understood by the business and everyone involved, that is when there's value in a program that can be invoked when a disaster actually strikes. So even though you might not be ready to tackle the entire business continuity program, a pandemic is a threat that is here with us and is far from over. So Pearl is going to share some thoughts as to why we should still be thinking about a formalized pandemic continuity program, and then tackle these elements and speak about them in the specific context of a pandemic.
Now let's look at our current disruption, which is COVID-19. I'm sure those of you that are still on this broadcast can agree with me that many organizations still need a pandemic business continuity plan. Having documented how they got through the first few weeks of the pandemic may not be the only scenario that needs to be considered. Now let's look at some of the things that need to be considered and unpacked further. We know that the pandemic is not over, and no one can with certainty say when it will be over. And businesses therefore still need to be ready to respond to several COVID-19 related scenarios, whether it's over the next year or more. Now, some organizations have implemented procedures for lockdown. The question here to ask is, have they been documented? Are the organizations satisfied with the way that they have responded? Do certain things perhaps still need to be improved upon? Lockdown is only one of the scenarios. How prepared is the organization for some of the other scenarios where people are sick and cannot work? We need to consider how critical or important operations will continue if people are off work. It's not possible, yes, I understand, to determine with certainty, or estimates so far vary, and that's because no one for sure knows how ill people are going to get over the next couple of months. But business continuity management is about planning for some of those unforeseen circumstances. Let's look at why some people would need to be off work and what are some of the scenarios that need to be considered. Scenario 1 is lockdown. This is the first scenario where people are not able to work or operate from their work premises. Scenario 2 is slightly different in that we could have a percentage of people or are not able to work or a reduction in staff. The difference here is that in scenario 1, people were able to work, but from scenario 2, they may not actually be able to function and operate and therefore work. And there are a number of reasons, and some of those reasons include that people could be sick or quarantined, whether they are themselves suspected or have the actual virus or are even post-infectious cases. It could be that they are fulfilling volunteer roles in their community. It could be that they are caring for school-aged children or other family members, or preferring to remain home or under mandatory orders by doctors. So there are various reasons why people could be ill and not be able to operate in large numbers. Scenario 3 looks at perhaps a breakout of the pandemic in the organization. Here the organization would need to make sure that they have some form of containment strategies, communication plans, etc. to accommodate this scenario. Scenario 4 is a worst case scenario where you may even have deaths or very, very sick staff. And imagine including those that are key resources in your organizations. So at this phase, it's accommodating for operating with people not possible to come back that are key to your organization. Scenario 5 is when perhaps your critical suppliers or your third parties are not able to deliver. How does that impact your own business and its continuity? Have you identified other suppliers that are able to assist you during these times? These are the type of things to look at in scenario 5. Now, using these BCM principles, we can then formalize pandemic continuity plans for any of these defined scenarios. How we go about putting together a pandemic continuity plan is to use the same methodology as Denise discussed earlier. But this time, we look at just one type of disaster, a pandemic. First and foremost is to understand what has been done up to date within the organization, understand the decisions that have been made, and the processes that have been put in place. If nothing is in place, then this is also an opportune time to define these and make sure that they're put in place. The first thing to do is to define and manage a pandemic continuity program. Plan the scope of the program and agree the scenarios. Appoint your executive project sponsors and your program leads, and ultimately outline the journey of the program. Second phase is to conduct the business impact analysis, and that consists of assessing all your business risk documentation, understanding the vulnerabilities and the risks at hand due to the pandemic, and to then undertake that analysis on critical business processes, looking at the resources, dependencies, recovery times, etc. that may impact certain decisions. The next phase would be putting together the pandemic continuity strategy. And here we determine the recovery alternatives and some of the decisions for those recovery alternatives. It's to actually develop the actual business continuity solutions, how it will operate, which vendors it will bring in, and putting together those policies that define the new way of being, whether those are HR policy on how staff is to conduct their work, or it could be an IT policy that defines the new way of using technology in order to carry out business functions. Once the strategy is defined, the actual continuity plan is put in place. And that continuity plan will address pandemic alert procedures. This is important for us to know how everything is going to carry out in the event of that pandemic. Looking at pandemic response plans, how the communication will happen, emergency response teams will be called upon, how incident response is going to work, how IT is going to be engaged. And most importantly in this phase is to integrate the existing business continuity plans or the processes that may already exist within the organization. Then last is to actually implement the pandemic continuity plan. How do we do that? We do that by rolling out awareness and orientation programs, by making sure that we verify all our alert and response measures. We conduct personal training. Obviously, this is where it's required. We make sure that we acquire or we install the resources that we're going to need. And most importantly, actively monitor and measure our efforts.
So it's up to you whether to start with a pandemic-specific business continuity program or to look wider and cover all possible disruptions. What is important is to go through the thought process of what could disrupt operations, to understand what processes or functions would be impacted, and to then decide on what you would need to do to recover and how. Acting on a business disruption does not have to be crisis management. All it takes is some effort and commitment in thinking ahead and making sure that everyone knows what needs to happen in the event of a disruption, so that your business operations recover with as little impact as possible. We trust that this video gave you some insight on how to tackle a business continuity program in your company and gave you some points to think about and consider as you decide what would work best for you. Thanks for listening.